Lovely. Hi, everyone. My name is Pamphinette Buisa. My pronouns are she, her. I am a student at UVic. I also play rugby for Team Canada. And a lot of the things I've been doing recently has been a lot of being a community organizer. I'm really passionate about human rights and uplifting and amplifying voices of those who are oftentimes silenced. Yeah, it's a bit about me. Yeah.
Kwekwe Watsi. Hello and greetings everyone from Lekwungen and Wasanich territories. My name is Christina Bonsman. I'm a member of the Abenaki Nation from the village of Odanak on the East Coast. I am a faculty member in the Department of History and Indigenous Studies program here at UVic.
Cool, thank you so much, both of you. And with that, we will get started with our conversation. And thanks everybody for your patience. So Pamphinette, Christine, can each of you share your personal experiences in sport and any discrimination you may have faced as women and/or Black Indigenous women in sport?
Yeah, so I played rugby at UVic, came from Ottawa and then moved to Gatineau and then kind of moved over to the West Coast and then progressively made my way to the national team. And a lot of the discrimination that I'd say was oftentimes microaggressions. And it's interesting because, you know, my goal was always to be an elite athlete, to play high performance sport. And in itself, trying to be a high performance athlete is very difficult. On top of that, the layers of being a Black woman, being a woman, there is certain things that I have to be hyper aware of when I'm in certain spaces, especially in a sport that I play. It's a predominantly white sport. So there's certain inequalities that I've had to face within sport, especially being a predominantly white sport, being a Black girl. If I mess up, it shows. If I do well, it shows. And so always having to stand out and knowing the pressures of that and being perhaps the one Black girl in the room or on the team. So oftentimes, yes, my experiences with discrimination has been luckily more subtle ways, but it's definitely impacted my drive and my concerted effort to make sure that I'm in a space not because the fact that I'm a person of color, but because I'm a good athlete. And along with that is that my identity and who I am helps me become that great athlete. So, yeah.
All right, so my participation in sport goes back to as long as I can remember. I started playing soccer at the age of 4. I still play soccer. I played sports my whole life. And I think growing up, I was very much a multi-sport athlete. I played soccer, ringette, hockey, basketball. And I really had a desire to pursue sport. What ultimately happened for me, I was a high school student. I had elite coaches working with me in basketball. As you can't tell here, but I'm quite tall. So there was some ideas that maybe I could pursue athletic scholarships in the States and go on to play basketball. And I started down this path, and what I came to the realization, and I'm really going to age myself here, was that there were very few opportunities. And so the question was for me, so what? I'm going to go and pursue an athletic opportunity for 4, maybe 5 years, and there was really nothing. There was rumblings at the time of maybe a women's national basketball league, what we now have, the WNBA. But I made a decision based on what my educational goals were and some of the sacrifices of my parents, I think personally, financially, to get me to post-secondary education, that I would stop pursuing those opportunities. And so what I did instead was I went to university and I studied sports. And so I went through phys ed, sport management, and ultimately got into the area of sociocultural studies and sport, where I got to merge my two passions, learning more about Indigenous history, Indigenous politics, Indigenous governance. And I got to be introduced to this world of Indigenous rights and sport. For me, one of the most eye-opening experiences I had was doing my master's thesis on 2 Indigenous women who competed in the Olympic Games in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. The first sisters who I think in Indigenous circles have really celebrated their successes, but through this thesis, I got to learn a lot about the discrimination and experiences of these women in mainstream sport and the challenges Indigenous people face within Canada's mainstream sports model. So that opened up a whole world for me to continue to pursue studying sport. And I always think of myself in my research as the intent of my work is to always advocate for Indigenous rights and the advancement of Indigenous people in sports.
Thanks, Pamphinette. Thanks, Christine. So today we opened with a territory acknowledgement recognizing the importance of land and place. I hope that today we can also highlight the inherent violent aspects of sport, particularly as it relates to the land and water, and what this means for marginalized, disadvantaged, and vulnerable people and groups. Yeah.
I can start with this. So for me, as I mentioned, the central focus of a lot of my research has been on Indigenous rights, and I have studied extensively the hosting of mega sporting events. So I can talk about this all day, but I'll try to limit some of my points here to acknowledging that the rise of international sport throughout the 20th century has presented some very real challenges for Indigenous people and marginalized groups around the world. There was this intention by early Olympic organizers who were entirely white, entirely male, entirely of the upper class, to establish a sports festival that would move around the globe. And I think that what comes with this are very inherent imperial desires and colonial intentions, that to have that ability to move throughout the world and to modernize the world through sport has had damaging impacts. And I think within the Canadian context, we can look to the Vancouver Olympic Games, and a lot of the opposition to the games coalesced under this campaign, No Olympics on Stolen Native Land. And so a lot of issues around environmentalism and homelessness and housing, all centered around the fact that the Olympic movement was in violation of treaty rights, or the lack of treaty rights in Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Lil'wat, and Squamish territories. And so there is this matter within not just the Olympic movement, but the Commonwealth Games, the Pan American Games, and many international sporting events that move around the world on various cycles into territories and regions of the world that are going to pose significant risks to my work covers a lot on Indigenous people, but other marginalized groups. And so the example I just want to briefly highlight here is that there was, of course, a question of Indigenous land rights in the Vancouver Games. But there were many promises in Vancouver's bid, the bid book that secured the rights to host the games, around housing and the legacy that would be established through the Olympic Games to protect housing rights and to preserve and create low-cost housing through Olympic organization. There was the creation of the inner city housing table by the Vancouver organizers, by VANOC, which were bid promises, which is why Vancouver was awarded the Olympic Games, was because there were these promises to legacies and sustainability. But within a year in the lead up to the games, many of these promises had been broken. And I was just looking over some of the statistics, and particularly related to the downtown east side and some of the vulnerabilities that were established or emphasized as a result of the Olympics. That the increase, there was almost a 400% increase in the lead up to the games in homelessness. So the number of people experiencing homelessness drastically increased. And specifically, a third of these people were Indigenous people. And this was really linked into not just the vulnerability of this population of Indigenous people, but how this links into missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so we already have this crisis in settler colonial Canada, and the arrival of the games is not just about the violence that are inherent in sport and as athletes and participants in sport, but what sport as a mega event or as an institution does, and the damages it causes around the world. And so the threat it poses, I think in the case of Vancouver, we can look at so many more in Rio and all around the world. So I'll just highlight that and leave that at that point.
Yeah, it just kind of made me think about in some of the multi-sport games that I've attended internationally, and just kind of seeing what's happening outside the stadium, from cues about security, about certain areas that are considered red zones, meaning areas that are considered dangerous. So it was just interesting, like playing on the stadium, you know, representing my country, and also realizing what lands that we were on, and realizing some of the consequences of being in that space. And so obviously as an athlete, my goal is to, you know, focus on the game, but it's always interesting to see the behind the scenes work that's done, and at whose at what cost, essentially. And I think that's the hard thing about it, is that it's difficult because as an athlete you don't want to be in two minds. You're there to deliver, to, you know, win, but it's also asking the question is who's losing and who's not a part of that conversation and a part of these situations. And as Christine was talking about, is the vulnerable people in megasports that occurred here, even in Canada, and seeing what happens in other megasport places and megasport events, is whose lives are not considered, who doesn't matter, and who isn't a part of that conversation.
Thanks, Pamphinette. Since we're on the topic of international and mega sporting events, can you share your thoughts on sport as a potentially violent space, particularly for cisgender girls and women and non-binary and trans folks? Also, do you see Black, Indigenous, and people of color athletes as being particularly vulnerable to such violence within sporting events? And I'll start with you, Christine, again, I think.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so there's a lot that can be said here. I think that I will again refer back to the Olympic movement, and a lot of research and scholarship that's paid attention to, discrimination has focused on the experiences of white women, and a lot of the literature that focuses on race has focused on the experiences of Black men. And so the intersectionality is, I think, in the last decade really where we're starting to delve into and to learn a lot more. Just to provide a little bit of a background on the organizational structure of modern sport, and I think everyone's aware that modern sport has arisen in these binary classifications of female and male. And so there's only two options, and which obviously presents very difficult challenges for intersex, non-binary, for transgender athletes. And so we have these two categories that we're left to deal with. And this extends from grassroots all the way up to elite sport like the Olympic Games or professional sport. And so the struggle has long been for women's emergence into sport. And that the stage gets set in the 1920s for women to participate in sport, the 1928 Olympic Games specifically. But it was really on male terms. And so sport is about defining masculinity against that of femininity. And so women were accepted into modern sport on the pretense that they would be feminine and they wouldn't display qualities of masculinity. And so the early examples is the prevention of women running distance events as early as 1926, because the men were appalled by the exhaustion levels of women after running middle distance events and anything higher. So we really don't see women participate in these sorts of events for quite some time. What I really want to emphasize here is that one of the, I think, most violent aspects of modern sport is what has been controlled through doping or sex testing. And just to briefly go through what we now see, or what history has revealed and what a lot of women are currently experiencing in sport, and that is the need for men to control the bodies within the female category. And so from 1928, from the first official games women were allowed into right up until the mid 1960s, there was a requirement, if there was a question around the femaleness of participants in the female category, that they had to go through physical examinations, or what are called the nude parades. They had to physically undress, often only to male medical professionals, and go through physical testing. In the 1960s, for the 1968 games, we had chromosome testing that was introduced, and that is to verify the presence of an XY chromosome makeup and the XX chromosome makeup. And so it was less invasive. It was just a swab of the mouth, but it created very real challenges for athletes, psychological challenges. Many athletes who identified as female and then were told that they were intersex or that they couldn't participate in the games. And in this period between 1968 and 1996, women had to carry what were called sex cards or certificates of femininity, to prove that they were actually legitimate in terms of participating in that category. And so it seemed that this had been abandoned by World Athletics and the Olympic movement by 2000. But as many people here are probably aware of the experiences of Caster Semenya and the challenges to her identity, has presented a whole new influx of testing and the need to establish testosterone levels and very invasive requirements that women who possess too much levels of testosterone need to go through medical procedures and potentially take medication on a daily basis just so they can participate in the female category within the Olympic movement. And so I just want to leave this point off because I know Pam has experience dealing with WADA and the rules around doping, by just recognizing that doping control in sport is not just about performance enhancement. It is the emergence of doping and the IOC Medical Commission and WADA is just as much about performance enhancement as it is about controlling participants within the female category. So at its origin, that was something that was a priority to control those factors. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, so essentially for us, we get doping testings. We essentially have to submit our whereabouts, meaning that anywhere we go, pretty much, we can get tested at any time to test, again, for high performance or like anything that's going to enhance your performance, to anything. It could be in the mouth, in a urine test, a blood test, and I believe they do another type of test, but essentially it's all regarding making sure that we are, following these guidelines. And it kind of brings to the point about the expectation of masculinity within sport, is that in a sport that I play in specifically, oftentimes people expect athletes to be more muscular, and it's interesting that you bring that up actually about it's not simply about performance enhancement, but it's also about the policing of bodies essentially. And there's a lot that goes into ensuring that we are doing our best and playing our best, but also to what extent we have to do that. We have to submit where we are going, and so we all also agree to do these things. But it's just interesting to see that there's an expectation of what bodies are can fit the mold. There's what bodies that are deemed as a female and deemed as a male, and the binaries in that as well shows can be harmful, especially for those that are non-binary, that are trans. And it's difficult because in a system that we have right now, it doesn't allow for anything in between. And so it's important to see that, to acknowledge it's a thing, but also that we are buying into a system that also does not and dismisses these bodies as well. So it's important to see that there's a violence there of dismissing an entire existence of people within that.
Thanks, both of you. What are some of the concerns of sexualized violence and gender-based violence in local contexts, specifically in our local communities and here at UVic? Yeah, Pamphinette, would you like to go?
Yeah, I would say for myself, before really coming to university, there wasn't much conversation about it. And so the question is, like, how do we normalize conversations about this? How do we normalize talking about consent culture? I know being on different types of teams, there's, you have this coaching staff, the coaches have a team manager, there's all these people that kind of predict your playing time, predict how long you're going to be on the team, predict also your experience altogether. So how do we normalize consent culture in a way that everybody is allowed to buy into this culture and it doesn't exclude other voices, it doesn't amplify others, but allows everybody to be a part of it? And as of my experiences, that wasn't very much a lot of what I was exposed to. But how do we make it a thing? How do we navigate sport and just the society right now, especially when we're hypersexualizing bodies. We are talking about rape culture and seeing that in different aspects, whether it be online or even in person. How do we make it a conversation? And honestly, it's just doing it. It's by creating spaces and so that people aren't seen as weak. And also the thing is for all the athletes that are on this is to recognize their position. What if you're not a starter? What if you are an impact sub? How do you stand up for your teammate when they may not have the same amount of privilege as you? And how do you back them? And number one, it could just be by having a conversation, by reaching out to them, by amplifying their voice, because ultimately, for a team to succeed, for the team culture to move forward, consent must be there. All parties must be involved. And as of right now, I see that there's a lot of room to grow in that aspect here locally, in our teams environments, in our work environments, and pretty much everywhere in society. Consent must be pivotal in every lens.
Yeah, I think you raised some incredible points there, and I won't, I know we're running out of time, so I won't expand too much more on that, but I do want to highlight what you talked about, rape culture and the need to call it out. And so recognizing that, yeah, there's many positive benefits and outcomes for sport and many reasons to participate, but we need to recognize, and for me particularly as a mother of 2 young daughters, recognizing male inclusive spaces and sport teams specifically as being potentially violent and being a threat. And so being driving forces for sexualized violence. And just a couple statistics looking at male inclusive spaces, sporting teams, the likelihood that those involved in teams are 300% more likely to commit sexualized violence than their non-affiliated male peers. College athletes make up less than 2% of campus populations, but they are more likely, over 20% more likely to be involved in sexual assaults on campus. And that women's interaction with the men who participate on these sports teams is the likelihood of being sexually assaulted is quite higher for women who interact within these male inclusive spaces. So I think recognizing rape culture and calling it out and acknowledging it for what it is, we need to bring those conversations into grassroots and onto campus, into campus realms.
Thank you both so much. I wanted to finally just wrap up with just asking you, what changes do you think we can facilitate that will help make sports safer, specifically for cisgender women, girls, and non-binary and trans folk?
I can start there. I think that for me, this idea of considering the sports pipeline, and that a lot of what we've talked about specifically in relationship to the Olympic Games is that we're talking about the experiences of people as athletes, as adult athletes. And we really have to look at changes within the sports pipeline, specifically at the grassroots level, and recognizing that that we need to start questioning things, that we have to start to encourage our young people, our youth, to question things and not to normalize these behaviors. And I think that we need to first begin by questioning the binary categories of boys and girls. And again, as a mother of 2 young children, how quickly they are sent in those directions into boys and girls. And these aren't simple conversations, and they're not straightforward, but the automatic acceptance, I think, is a first step. Another important aspect for me is to encourage greater participation of BIPOC, of gay, lesbian, queer, women, non-binary, and trans folks into coaching and administration. Pamphinette acknowledged that in terms of campus spaces, but we really need to proactively do that at grassroots levels, and that it's dominated by white male coaches, by a lot of fathers who are taking up these positions. And one clear strategy that I have learned about is the possibility of closing the gender gap between coaches and athletes. For example, as more LGBT youth are coming out at earlier ages, there's recognition that their heterosexual peers are more likely to respond positively or at least neutrally to them. So recognizing that coaches who have spent their careers as gatekeepers in an athletic climate where LGBT people were expected to remain in the closet, that although there might be levels of tolerance, that we need to find ways that it's not just about tolerance, that it's about acceptance, and it's about respect and all of these things. And so I just think that these are things that are front and center on my mind as the mother of 2 young girls who are starting to express and demonstrate a passion and interest in sport, and how can I help navigate them through what I know will be some really difficult moments as women in sports. So
Yeah, and I would say that it's all about being intentional. At the end of the day, we can start having conversations, have group talks, attend a Zoom chat like this, but how are you intentionally trying to engage with one another? So how are you going to show up for the athletes that are on here, for your teammate? How are you as a coach going to show up for your athletes? How are you as management going to ensure that those that don't have a voice, that may not be in the spaces that you occupy, are now seen and heard? And ultimately with that, I would say that, for me, a lot of my coaches have been very powerful, very wonderful. Brittany, you're on here, shout out to you. We're women, we're BIPOC people, and seeing early on, I grew up in Quebec, and seeing, people like, I'm gonna shout out Latoya Blackwood, who was a Black woman who was very powerful, and seeing a lot of people in leadership roles were very, very pivotal in my trajectory to the national team. And I would say is when you see someone that looks like you, that's in a position that you aspire to be in, or that you aspire to encompass certain qualities that they have, it does something different. It allows me to feel like I'm here, I'm okay, I feel supported, but it also shows that I can get there. And when we're also able to bridge that gap, that we're not different, it's not necessarily a top-down situation. We can do that by literally being intentional with how we want to bring people in these spaces. It's not by tokenizing them and by having certain people, but it's by being intentional, by engaging with community, by reaching out, by when you're looking to hire certain people, how are you doing that in a way that is considerate of who they are and making it sustainable so that they stay there and also feel comfortable and supported when they're there. I also bring that also to the people who watch sports, right? The conversation about consent also goes about how are we talking about people's bodies? How are we talking about this person is super huge and this person is not we have to think critically as to how we are dissecting each other's bodies. Because ultimately, sport is supposed to be, at least for me, it's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be about team. It's about camaraderie, especially a sport like rugby. It's about uplifting one another. And to buy into the true spirit of sport, you also have to be intentional by consenting into the culture, by consenting and having a consensual relationship with all parties to ensure that no body is dehumanized, no body is perceived as less than, and that all these bodies matter. I'm going to go back to that. All bodies matter, you know, and for that to be a thing, we need to be able to identify the issues within the binary structures, the issues of the systemic implications of people in leadership and people not in leadership. And ultimately with that, it's really important that you acknowledge what position you are, your positionality, and how you can be intentional with how you're engaging with people. And that's how I can say that the strategy, regardless of what strategy, you can make like policies and all those things. How are you intentionally trying to uplift and make sure this is a support system, or when these people are placed in these systems, that you are making sure they're supported when they're there. And that's for a person that is Black, that is a woman, and you know, is striving to do great in the world, is how can I feel supported when I'm trying to do great things? So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Pamphinette and Christine. This was such a wonderful chance to hear from both of you. And thank you everybody for your patience with all of our technical difficulties today. Before we jump into our question section, I just wanted to highlight that we are doing a $75 gift card giveaway. Actually, we're doing 2 gift cards to Come As You Are, which is a sex toy cooperative based in Canada. So if you just go to the link that's in the chat, you can enter a form to be entered to win one of the cards. I also wanted to highlight the supports that are available on campus. So I work with the Anti-Violence Project, and I'll be available for talking to people for at least half an hour after this event. You can call us at 778-400-5007 or email support@antiviolenceproject.org, and I'll post this all in the chat. You can also reach out to the UVic Office of Sexualized Violence Prevention, and I'll post the information for about that in the chat as well. All of these supports are available to folks on campus, and yeah, and thanks Clint for sharing that in the chat. If you have any questions for Pamphinette or Christine, you can just message those to me now. And we'll try to get them answered in a timely manner. Otherwise, that's kind of the end of our structured agenda for today. I think I'm hearing a question, or maybe just a comment about the differences between WADA's control on body/physiology as relates to Castor Semenya, but also Michael Phelps. I don't know if, Christine, you want to share anything you had thought about this? And
yeah, that's a great point. And so I think the comparison between Phelps and Castor Semenya, that is the pinnacle, is that Phelps, for all of his physiological attributes, is seen to have genetic gifts. And so the motto of the Olympics is faster, higher, stronger. These are the attributes that we attach to athletes. And yet when we have those who compete in the female category, who are faster and stronger, they become anomalies and they need to be controlled. And so the fact of the matter is what the intent is to control doping in sport and to protect athletes' bodies from the effects, the biological, physiological effects of doping. And yet you are asking women, and so I didn't get into it, but asking women to genetically or to physically alter their bodies. And we are starting to learn these are having devastating consequences on many, psychologically, physically, on women who have to go through medical procedures and have to take daily doses of medication for the rest of their lives so they can compete in sport within the female category. But for men, there is no mechanism, there is no test. If a man is below the threshold of accepted, there's no accepted testosterone level, but for women, there's a maximum level. And so that it's such an important question. I think that comparison, just raising that, I appreciate that, because that's something that I think that there's a lot we can talk about related to those comparisons.
thanks so much again, Christine. Yeah, if there's no other questions, I think we're just going to leave it there. But again, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And please reach out if you would like to chat more about this. And I hope this sparks opportunities for conversation in your own lives. It certainly has in mine.